Welcome to the 2021 annual training for supervisors. This is in addition to the employee training for our drug-free workplace policy. Probably the most challenging area of our policy to understand as a supervisor is to discern when it is you would send somebody in for a reasonable suspicion drug test. And that's the least clear part of our policy, and one that that is underutilized. I say that is I can't remember the last time we did a reasonable suspicion drug test, and certainly it is a tool available to help us manage our workplace a little more safe. So today's training will be on reasonable suspicion drug tests, or as the speaker would call them, for cause. You're going to send somebody in for drug test for cause. And this is a webinar that was recorded June of 2020, and it's pretty timely. So the training today is based on reasonable suspicion drug testing. The training will be concluded at the end of the video, and you will have completed that. If you have any questions or comments regarding the reasonable suspicion drug testing or any other part of our drug-free workplace policy, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you, and please pay attention to this training.
Our Hire Right webinar on reasonable suspicion policies, procedures, and best practices. My name is Katie Brito. I'm the moderator today. I'm also the director of DHS Solutions at Hire Right. Before we get started, I just want to go through a couple housekeeping items. One is just to let you know that Hire Right prepared this presentation for informational purposes only, and it's not intended to be substituted for legal advice. Should you have any legal questions, please direct them to your legal counsel. Before we begin, again, some housekeeping items. Hire Right, HRCI and SHRM credit information will be sent via email tomorrow, along with a recording of this webinar session. If you're experiencing any audio or visual issues, please refresh the browser window by clicking F5 on your keyboard, or let us know through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We will not be providing copies of today's slides. However, you may access our reasonable suspicion testing ebook in the resource section of the webinar. This is located in the green at the bottom of the toolbar. After the presentation, we would appreciate getting your feedback. Please take our short survey and let us know if this session was valuable and if you have any ideas for future topics. Now I'm going to introduce you to our speaker today. Dr. Todd Simo is our Chief Medical Officer and Managing Director of Transportation. If you're interested, you can view his bio as well in the links at the bottom. Dr. Simo, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you very much, Katie. So again, Todd Simo, Chief Medical Officer of Hire Right, as well as the executive in charge of our transportation unit. I mean, this webinar, I think, is very timely. And this actually was spawned out of, the recommendations that we got after several of our last emails or last webinars, that, a bunch of people came back saying, hey, we'd love, some reasonable suspicion training. And I think, as we're all emerging from, being sequestered to our homes, returning to job sites as needed, that, so to speak, reasonable suspicion testing is a vital tool in any kind of drug-free workplace program. And knowing kind of trigger events, and I'll kind of use that term multiple times today. What are the trigger events to compel you as a company to have a for-cause drug screen? So when I say a for-cause drug screen, I kind of use for-cause and reasonable suspicion as kind of one and the same, because it's something that based upon observation, based upon an articulable situation, that you all of a sudden are going to compel a testing event. And then those testing events aren't only for for a drug screen, whether that be oral fluid or urine, but also an alcohol test. Because I spend a lot of time talking about drugs and talking about marijuana, cocaine, and opioids and things. When you start talking about for-cause testing, the #1 drug of abuse in the United States is the same as the #1 drug of abuse in the world, and that's alcohol. So again, we got to keep that front of mind when we're talking about these type of issues. But from an agenda perspective, we're going to go through these. I always like just touching on the value of a drug-free workplace program, signs of workplace intoxication and impairment, because some of the drugs that we'll talk about, intoxication and impairment, have completely different windows. So they're not just because, when you're intoxicated, you're impaired, but there's times where you're no longer intoxicated that you remain impaired. We're also going to talk about how do you document those observations. We're going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the medical review process as it pertains to reasonable suspicion. Statuses that affect reasonable, state statutes, that impact the for-cause testing, and then how to improve your overall program. So again, if you've seen or heard any of my webinars before, watched any of the presentations, I use this one quite a bit, because drug-free workplace programs are really set up to deter people from coming on. So the more you can promote it within your recruiting sites, within your conversations with candidates, that you maintain a drug-free workplace program, you're going to automatically have a better program. Choosing a specimen that avoid subversion by the donor, that alternate specimens like hair and oral fluid do, will increase your deterrence factor. So the more you detect, the more you deter, and the longer that you detect at a higher rate, ultimately your positivity rate will decrease year over year. And that's all that, so to speak, deterrence effect. Because, I'm going to go through dollar values coming up, but the best drug screen you ever do, or the highest value drug screen that you ever do, is actually the test that you never have to collect. 10 out of 10 people out there doing drugs know it. So that, that's a statistic I like using all the time. So people that are using illicit drugs know it. The more they're told that you support a drug-free workplace program, the more that you tell them that we do have this program in place. That is the aim of that program is to keep our employees safe and productive. When you go through that, a certain amount of those people are going to opt out of the process, just not go forward. So you've gotten all the value of, so to speak, keeping an illicit drug user off your workforce, with none of the spend that's associated with a drug test. So from that perspective, the goals of a drug-free workplace program is, again, safety, preventing accidents, so to speak, efficiencies. So reducing absenteeism, improving the overall health of your employees, decreasing litigation costs from workplace accidents, negligence claims. And again, illicit drug users have 3 times the healthcare costs of a, so to speak, a non-illicit, drug using employee. So all of those things, protect employees, reduce costs, improve productivity, and increase overall workers' welfare. And the return on investment here, there's been, the Obama administration actually in its first term did a lot of look and say, how much does illicit drug use cost employers? Just in terms of productivity alone, his administration came through saying, due to absenteeism, due to working in a less efficient environment, a less efficient, when they're, using, that it will save companies $81 billion a year. All illicit drug use came out. So you have $81 billion a year just based upon productivity. When you factor in 5 times the workman comp claims, 3 times the healthcare cost, the cost of litigation, and even some of the soft costs like brand protection, and even the hard costs of shrinkage, right? You know, people in the retail sector know what shrinkage is. That's, you know, employee theft. You know, you all of a sudden add another $80 billion to it. So the overall number is in the $190 billion range that illicit drug use costs employers. When you look at the National Institute of Drug Addiction, that group opines that there's anywhere from 10 to 14 million, you know, people dependent upon an illicit substance in the workforce at any point in time. So, you know, with some easy math, but a lot of zeros, you know, 190 billion divided by, you know, 14 million is around $14,000 a year that you as an employer save when you know, so to speak, catch an illicit drug user. So that's just something that when you're looking at your program and going, hey, you know, we've done 20 drug screening this year at our small business, and we've had 2 positives. Well, those 2 positives ultimately saved your organization $28,000 a year in terms of risk mitigation. So again, that $28,000 a year, you know, more than paid for all of those 20 drug screens that were done. So, you know, those are kind of the numbers that you can use as we're going through here. So now we're going to talk about, you know, signs of intoxication and impairment. There's a certain amount of overlap here, but there is also a certain amount where they're distinctly different. So intoxication, and a lot of times intoxication is really a term used, you know, for alcohol, that they, you know, alcohol is intoxicating. So that's why, you know, one of the definitions here is inebriation and drunkenness that is directly related to alcohol. But you also have intoxication in regards to, you know, overpowering exhilaration or excitement of the mind or emotion. So, you know, when you're, so to speak, intoxicated, you can have those almost stimulant effects when you start talking about overpowering exhilaration and excitement of the mind and emotions. You know, right when I read that as a definition, that just spurred me immediately, you know, to stimulants like methamphetamine and cocaine. Certainly alcohol causes that in the initial stages of its intoxication through its disinhibiting effect. So you're less inhibited and therefore more apt to do rash actions. Now, impairment from a definition perspective is a state of being diminished, weakened, damaged, especially mentally or physically. So when I look at impairment, really impairment is the inability to do something which you could normally do. So when you use a substance, all of a sudden you're, you know, prior to doing that, you're able to do things in a certain capacity, do things within a certain speed. And then after you use that drug, those things have diminished. So you're not able to work as quick. You're not able to make as fast of the decisions. That you have some, you know, retarded activities that keep you from doing things that you're when you're not, so to speak, impaired, that you're able to do. So, you know, the above 2 terms are often used interchangeably, but the big part is the however. You know, some drugs cause intoxication and impairment at the same time. So they have the same window. So think of alcohol. You know, when you go out and if you drink, you know, a beer, you have a certain level of intoxication and impairment. As you drink 2 beers, it goes up. As you drink 3 beers, as you drink 3 beers in 1 hour, your blood alcohol level goes up a certain amount. And as your blood alcohol level goes up, you're more intoxicated and you're more impaired. As your blood alcohol level reaches back to 0, your intoxication is going away as well as your impairment. Now, some drugs cause, you know, intoxication, along with a different and longer impairment window. So from this perspective, think of, marijuana. So marijuana, I've talked about in several webinars that you use it and you're acutely intoxicated, so you're high. And during that period of being high, certainly you can make bad decisions and not be as attentive. But as the marijuana wears off, the people no longer feel high, they no longer feel intoxicated. But THC as a substance remains in the system and impacts people profoundly in their ability to make determinations of spatial distances in terms of being able to, track multiple different objects within within their visual field, or track multiple different events happening at the same time, as well as making them complex and rapid decisions. So that's an impairment effect that lasts well beyond the intoxicating effect of marijuana. There's actually, when you look at intoxication from, let's use cocaine and methamphetamine, those stimulants, all of a sudden you're profoundly exhilarated. You all of a sudden are making rash actions due to, the effect of those drugs, making you feel like a superhuman. They are disinhibiting, which makes you, do things that you ordinarily wouldn't do. And that's when they're intoxicated. There is an impairment effect that lasts afterwards, where that impairment effect is, as you come down from that high, you crash. And when I say crash, your central nervous system has been so overstimulated that it no longer functions properly, and it wants to shut down. It wants to go to sleep. And if you're a truck driver moving a load and you've been driving and you've been using a stimulant to keep yourself awake, so you can keep, and now you run out of that stimulant, well, now you go from being intoxicated on a drug, which is impairing, to impairment effect that is no longer related to the intoxication. In fact, it's related to the withdrawal of that drug from your system. So you spontaneously fall asleep. And everyone on this call knows it's a really bad day when a semi-driver spontaneously falls asleep as he or she is driving down the road. Those are catastrophic accidents, essentially. But it's the same thing if you're, a warehouse worker, or, in a manufacturing plant, in a grain mill. Falling asleep on the job can kill you right there, because those are, potentially hazardous environments. And then there are some drugs that cause impairment without intoxication. And I really look at these are opioids. So a lot of times opioids can cause an intoxication, but there is an impairment effect, especially at, doses where people just get them for, I just broke my ankle, I just hurt my knee, have a back injury. They're not a routine user of it. They all of a sudden use it, and they use it at a low enough dose that they don't really feel intoxicated or don't have an intoxicating effect, but they still have an impairment effect because they're not able to react as quickly. So that's an impairment without intoxication. So those are just some definitions. So signs of workplace intoxication, guess what? Those are fairly easy to identify. When someone is intoxicated, they look fairly impaired. So when you're talking about alcohol, you're talking about the clumsiness, the walking with a wide stance, difficulty walking, slurring of speech, poor judgment, dilated pupils. Marijuana, on the other hand, glassy red eyes, inappropriate laughter, again, the scent of marijuana on them, as well as just overall being lackadaisical and not wanting to do anything. Stimulants, on the other hand, are, hyperactivity, euphoria, excessive talking, very irritable. Again, dilated pupils. When you talk about opioids, and now when we're using opioids, especially in the intoxication, we're talking about huge, potentially huge doses of prescription opioids, or using, the non-prescription, opioid or opiate, heroin. And again, what you see there is, sleepiness, lethargy, twitching, contracted pupils. Again, if you see active needle marks, that's always a reason to look, for or compel a for-cause drug screen. So again, intoxication, and I kind of put this in there, is just kind of a graphic. It's the wiggly line person. It's the person that just doesn't look normal whatsoever. They're not acting normally. They're not speaking normally. They're not walking normally. They look, very, very, very impaired, but it's kind of obvious in terms of intoxication. And signs of workplace impairment are a bit more subtle. And I kind of throw alcohol in here as well as drugs, right? There's a certain amount of overlap here. And the big warning signs are change in behaviors. Sudden mood swings, mood changes, people that are happy and then sad and vacillate a great deal. Easily angered. If you all of a sudden start noticing absenteeism from work, especially leaving work early on Friday and coming in late on Monday. Those are two things that have a very high predictive value of drug abuse or dependence, whether it's alcohol or illicit drug. Inability to explain reasoning for doing things. So, Bill, why didn't you follow the safety protocol and beep your horn as you were turning the corner, with your forklift? I just forgot. I don't have a reason. I just don't do that. That type of thing, is much more concerning than the person that goes, I was distracted. I was on the radio with my boss and I was turning the corner. The first excuse is much more, much more damning to the individual than the second, even though they should always be following those safety rules. Things turn up missing. So now we're talking about shrinkage, theft. Frequent accidents or injuries, again, 5 times the workman comp rate. So again, these people are getting injured more often at work. If someone's tired all the time, and again, not following those established protocols, going out onto the warehouse floor without wearing your safety vest, doing something that you shouldn't be doing, not doing the normal safety inspection of the equipment that you're using. Doing those signs are all signs of workplace impairment. So again, much more subtle than intoxication. These people, aren't slurring their speech. They're not wobbling as they walk. They're not doing those things. They kind of come in, they clock in, they kind of look like they're ready to work. But when challenged in that way, they're not ready to work because they're not following the rules. They're not doing the things they're supposed to be doing. They get easily angered when you tell them, hey, Bill or Sally, you got to wear your safety vest while out here. They all of a sudden get easily angered and perturbed. Why are you telling me to do this? I'm just as safe. Again, those are those kind of soft signals that are much more subtle, but those are the signs of workplace impairment. Let's talk about alcohol impairment and intoxication. I say they go hand in hand. And again, I have this chart to the side. You can pull up this chart on the internet. It's pretty easy to see. When you first start drinking, you can be lightheaded and, feel kind of good. And as you go through and progress to other levels, once you hit about the 0.4 mark, that's really a level from a occupational perspective that all of a sudden the people start doing things that they shouldn't do that put them at risk at your job site as well as the people they work around at risk. So from a general perspective, occupational level of alcohol, which is considered impairing, is at a 0.4. The DUI in 49 of the 50 states, as I remember, is 0.8. Utah, within the last year, reduced their level, alcohol level to 0.05 for driving while intoxicated. The National Transportation Safety Board actually is a group that's propagating, breath alcohol level of 0.05 as the standard level. Just one state has taken advantage of it now. So as your blood alcohol level goes up, so does your impairment level. As your blood alcohol level comes down, so does your impairment level. So alcohol and workplace issues. And again, as I kind of said in the preamble to all of this, you know, alcohol is the #1 drug of abuse. Alcohol, when you see someone impaired on your job site, you know, certainly intoxicated on your job site or impaired on your drug site, alcohol should be, you know, the first thing you think of. So when you're compelling, you know, that for-cause test, you know, make sure that you compel an alcohol test. You know, alcohol can be, you know, easily collected in breath. There's a couple states like Minnesota and Maryland that don't allow you to do it in breath, where you can do it in oral fluid, or you can do it, you know, in urine. But having a mechanism in place for all of your, you know, job sites, you should really have that protocol in place to be able to compel an alcohol test as allowed by those state statutes. But again, you know, statistics, you know, really show that alcohol and use of alcohol, you know, prior to coming to work or during work, has a devastating effect on performance. It's opined that, you know, almost half of the workplace fatalities are associated with alcohol use, you know, alcohol abuse or dependence. You know, because alcohol affects all of those things that we need to be effective at the job site, you know, motor skills, sensory skills, perception, attitude, you know, cognition, everything that you think about. So it affects the vision, reflexes, coordinations, emotions, aggressiveness, judgment. You know, and again, alcohol deprives the worker of most of the tools he or she relies on to perform work safely. You know, there is an effect here when I say the impairment goes to zero, and this is probably much more prevalent in the non-routine drinker. So the person that, you know, goes out and has a bender for the Super Bowl and then wakes up, you know, the day after the Super Bowl with a raging headache and nausea. That certainly, you know, is impairing of itself. The person who's generally dependent upon alcohol, you know, really doesn't get hangovers. So, you know, again, but hangovers do have an effect. And then again, the sick dealing with those hangovers can, you know, cause accidents in and of themselves. So again, when you have people that, you know, making sure, hey, if you ever, you know, have a headache and nausea and don't feel well, don't come to work. You know, that's kind of one of the routine things that employers should put out there, especially in this time space continuum when we're talking about, you know, a viral illness that is so to speak, spread through respiratory droplets. Certainly staying at home when you don't feel well, you know, is a good thing. So again, when I talk about marijuana, intoxication, and impairment, again, the intoxicating effect of marijuana lasts anywhere from 3 to 6 hours, depending how much you use, how you used it, whether you ate it or smoked it, did something like that. And again, that high feeling of euphoria and relaxation with the profoundly impaired, you know, perception and motor skills. You know, and I've used this slide, there continues to be growing evidence that the impairment window of marijuana lasts beyond the intoxication window. The one thing with marijuana intoxication, which makes it different, and particularly makes it different from alcohol, you know, people who are, you know, impaired by alcohol, you know, tend to, you know, be very disinhibited and not realize how drunk they are. So those are the people that tend to be driving along and they're blowing through red lights because they're just not paying attention. You know, they don't care. They're trying to get somewhere. Marijuana, when people are intoxicated, those people, the effect of THC, the impairing cannabinoid, the effect on the brain is vastly different. Those people feel impaired. They feel like they can't do things. Those are the people that get behind the wheel of the car and stop at a green light and look both ways to make sure no one's coming. those are the people that are, entering an on-ramp and stop in the middle of the on-ramp to find out if anybody's in the zip code of the freeway that they're trying to, turn on to prior to them turning on. They're, very aware that they're impaired, and therefore they take extreme steps to try to avoid accidents. The problem is if you're stopping at green lights or stopping at on-ramps, a lot of other people aren't doing that because, it's not the way, people interact in those situations. So again, accidents go up, and that's been reported by, the Insurance Safety Board and such in terms of states that have decriminalized it for recreational use. But the evidence here of the impairment, that once that intoxication's gone away, these people no longer feel impaired or, no longer feel intoxicated, but the impairment, as I said before, spatial discrimination, how far away from something I am, multiple task tracking. So, hey, I have to look at the environment and kind of track that there's a girl on the side of the road. She's playing with a ball. There's a car in front of me that is approaching a stop sign. There's a guy mowing the lawn on the right. Being able to track all of those, because, they tend not to do well. They tend to fixate on one object, the bumper of the car in front of them. And if, they're not tracking the little girl with the ball and that ball rolls out in front of their vehicle, guess what? They're not really tracking that. They don't have that ability anymore. And then, making quick decisions, quick, complex decisions. So those are the three things that even when they no longer feel intoxicated, that they are still impaired. And I'll freely say, in terms of blue collar labor, spatial discrimination, multiple task tracking, and making quick decisions is really, really important, because in any, so to speak, industrial, manufacturing, agribusiness, transportation, logistics, all of those things are very, very, important in your ability to successfully complete those. So workplace issues, again, marijuana is the #2 drug of abuse in the United States, and it has, long-term effect on performance and cognition. And again, marijuana is not only impairing during the intoxication phase, it has that, impairment that lasts well beyond it. Again, studies, nearly, all the studies I read, it showed an impairment out to greater than 24 hours. They stopped testing at 24 hours. There are studies out there that show it for 3 days. One study of note shows some impairing effect out to 7 days. So again, intoxication and impairment aren't the same windows in marijuana. Stimulants, again, intoxication. I kind of went through this before. These people are the ones that are hyper. They're excitable, they're restless, they're talkative. They may have the sensation of bugs crawling on their skin, so they're itching their hands and neck and such. They tend to be confused. They can hallucinate again, but it's generally that restlessness, that anxiety, that moodiness that are the real things that you can appreciate. There is an impairment that follows this variable duration. It can, if someone's a routine stimulant abuser, they can actually impact, their CNS in a long-term way, and actually provoke different psychiatric issues due to their stimulant, prolonged stimulant abuse. And then again, the big one is inappropriate sleepiness. So all of a sudden you've been hyperstimulated for a long period of time. As you come down from that hyperstimulation, you become inappropriately sleepy, and then you crash. And I think crashing here is a very appropriate term, for stimulant abusers, because, when they crash, they can cause crashes, particularly if they're, operating their own vehicle or something, or a vehicle for their company. So stimulants and workplace issues, I do put this graphic up here. Stimulants, people who are using stimulants are far more prone, due to the cost of the stimulants, to steal from their employers. But again, they're erratic, they have impulsive behavior, and they make poor decisions. Again, the hangover effect, you know, the crashing is there. And again, absenteeism, tardiness, all of those things I related in the first slide on return on investment are very much in play. You know, do not, you know, put people who are using, you know, stimulants such as Adderall, Vyvanse, methylphenidate in the same category as the people who are, you know, stimulant abusers or dependent. You know, if you truly have attention deficit disorder, or, you know, some form of narcolepsy or something else, the low dose stimulant that those people on basically corrects their brain chemistry and essentially has them act, I'll just say quote unquote normal with air quotes in there. And those people, you know, don't seem to have a long-term effect when they're on it. If you're inappropriately getting Adderall because you really don't have AED, but you feign the symptoms because you want to get something, you know, get something that keeps you up all night so you can do other stuff, you know, those people are the ones that tend to have long-term effects. Those are the kind of gateway to becoming a dependent on those drugs. But again, you know, people who are truly have AED, again, you know, the low dose of amphetamines that they're using really doesn't impact them in a negative way. So now in terms of opioids, so in many cases, opioid use, you know, is therapeutic and not really an intoxicating agent. Again, you know, there's some people that, you know, feign, you know, injuries to get opioids and then use them in an appropriately high way. The other people out there that are opioid addicts, that are addicted to opioids and continuing to need escalating doses to get the impairing effects that they're ultimately looking for. So some of the intoxicating effects that they're ultimately looking for. You know, the problem with opiates is they're very habituating. So the more you use, potentially the more you'll need. And there really comes a point in time with opioid addiction that the window of feeling high is almost the same as being dead. So, you know, our body's set point of how much opiates it can take doesn't really change, even though our opiate demand, you know, may change year over year as we use more and more. So that's why, you know, the opioid crisis that this country has gone through and continues to go through, even though overall use is on the decline. You know, this makes this drug particularly bad because this drug is one of those things that can kill you right here. You know, so if you're all of a sudden use it, you know, if you're buying it from the guy on the street corner, by definition, who is a drug dealer, you know, he or she doesn't have any quality control measures in place. And therefore you could get a spike dose that has a very high level of some sort of opioid substance. You know, carfentanil is actually a drug that was developed and actually used as a chemical weapon in Russia. And that's being sprayed on some lower grade heroin products to make people think they really got the good stuff. And unfortunately, that good stuff is a very extra small amount of that can kill you right there. So, you know, again, that's why this drug has gotten a lot of media attention. So from a, you know, intoxication and impairment perspective, you know, these people, you know, when profoundly intoxicated will be slurring their speech. They'll look very lethargic. They'll have, you know, pinpoint pupils, you know, and then opioid, so to speak, abusers, you know, will have, you know, impaired coordination, but when they're withdrawing, you'll all of a sudden see that they're really irritable. They have huge mood swings. These people tend to wear long sleeve shirts all the time. So even if you're living in Georgia and it's 100 degrees outside with 98% humidity, these people will be wearing a long sleeve shirt. Because guess what? The track marks become very apparent and they don't want anybody to see those. So the workplace issues here, you know, you get the effects of a mental, retarding agent, right? That people become lethargic, they don't want to do things, they tend to not pay attention, and all of a sudden that can lead to a variety of workplace accidents. They don't react as fast, again, causing workplace accidents. Opioids do have a legitimate use for alleviating pain, and there are multiple medical studies out there that if, a person who has, degenerative disc disease, has multiple level issues in their back that gives them chronic pain, that opiates do help with that, do help alleviate that pain, help them, stay active. Those doses tend not to escalate. They tend to stay fairly static. And as they stay fairly static, the impairment from opioid use tends to go away. Our body habituates to it, which means that person using, 10 milligrams of oxycodone every morning, is really at no increased risk for accident than someone who isn't using that drug. So, that's, but that's that stable opioid user. The problem is it's very hard to determine who's the stable opioid user and who's the one that's escalating on his or her own. And then the effects on performances, that apathy, that inability to make quick decision making, that inability to react fastly, just physically, because of the depression and fatigue and slow breath sex. So all of those things, again, particularly at any job site, aren't exactly conducive to a safe workplace. So here we go into documentation. So again, this is for-cause testing. So I kind of lump, a reasonable suspicion with post-accident testing due to the recent OSHA, stance that, hey, for a post-accident test to be done, you have to have a reason to believe that the person was injured because they may be impaired at your job site. So I really look at, both reasonable suspicion and post-accident testing being a continuum of the same, company for-cause test where there's a defined trigger event and observations that compel that testing. So from a pure definition perspective, drug testing an employee, and when I say drug testing, it's drug and alcohol testing of employee based on a company-defined trigger event that's based upon observations of employees' actions or behaviors where it is believed the employee may be impaired due to illicit drug use, and in this term, drug or alcohol use. The trigger event is an event that happens at work that the company believes the person may be impaired. So I say trigger event. This is the person that is supposed to beep their horn as they turn the corner, and they didn't beep their horn as they turned the corner with their forklift in the distribution center, and they end up hitting an employee, and now there's a workplace incident. Well, the employee that was wearing their safety belt, wearing their safety vest, doing all their safety protocols, shouldn't be the one drug tested. It's actually the person that had the trigger event. The person that didn't follow the safety protocols, should be tested. And then that's an observation, but you also have the ones that may not have a specific event happen, but there's those articulable observations. The person is acting erratically, the person shouting at their supervisor, it's a change in behavior, their productivity is going down, all of those things, along with they smell of marijuana, they smell of alcohol, they're shuffling their feet, as they walk, those are those observations. And for-cause testing, what it is a blanket post-accident policy. If you get in an accident, you have to have a drug test. The OSHA really frowns upon that. And testing where there is no, specific contemporaneous trigger event or observation. So, it shouldn't just be like, well, we can test you, for cause whenever we want, because from that perspective, there will be state statutes that don't allow you to do that. There may be EEOC issues even beyond that happen. So again, tying for-cause events to those, trigger events and observations, are very important, and having a policy in that regard to ensure that you follow your policy 100% of the time, no matter if it's a white female or an African-American male, or, an Asian, Asian American transsexual, whatever the permutation and mix is, the policy should be uniform and based upon observations and trigger events. Because if you ever show that you're discriminating against any class, you're really on the short branches from an EEOC perspective. So, have that written policy, mention for-cause, testing in that policy in any employment contracts, employee handbooks. Define your trigger events. You can have very broad definitions of it, not following safety protocols. That can be a trigger event. That's defined, that's broadly defined. You don't have to go through every one of them, like honking as you turn a corner with your forklift or wearing your safety belt, but you can have those kind of broader definitions of them. What observations are we looking for? There's several that you can all of a sudden say, here's the observations that we look for. Train your management staff and your employees on those signs and symptoms, of drug abuse, dependence, alcohol use or misuse. Make sure it's non-discriminatory, so no harassment is done to any one employee or any class of employees, right? And the employee, must give a specimen. So if you all of a sudden say, hey, John employee, we have this trigger event, and now we're compelling testing on you, it should be defined within your policy what happens if John employee goes, I'm not doing that. You're not allowed to do drug screening on me. From that perspective, you should have it defined in your policy how you handle that type of refusal to test. And it should be explicit and followed, 100% of the time. And again, that's an integral part of your policy to have what employment actions can happen. So documentation. So again, I just really pulled this questionnaire off and just took a quick a picture of it, so to speak. But there's several online. You can create your own, but you should have a way to capture those trigger events and observations. They should have physical signs such as walking, standing movements, how they're speaking, what their eyes look like. Things such as smell of marijuana, smell of alcohol, behavior, what demeanor and what actions are happening. So this is really where that trigger event may fall into. And then miscellaneous, hey, John employee opened up his locker and a bottle of Jack Daniels fell out of it and spilled on the floor. All of a sudden you have something that really, hey, and John has been, has other physical signs that may be the thing that we're compelling, on the job misconduct. So again, that's a trigger event that you can use to say, hey, we're going to compel testing because of, gross misconduct, you not following what you should have been doing from a company policy perspective. And again, when you're looking at any alcohol, marijuana, stimulants, any of those, either cause lethargy or cause excitability, and any of those things can lead to job misconduct. So again, that's just one of those overall signs of impairment. Now, when we go to the MRO perspective, the MRO's duty in the drug screening program is to offer the donor a reasonable, to provide a reasonable, verifiable medical explanation for the result. So if a person is positive for, oxycodone, and the person has an oxycodone prescription, that is, a reason to overturn the result and make it negative. The level of a drug screen, or the level of a drug, within a test. So now it's an oxycodone level of 25,000 nanograms per milliliter. That level really doesn't mean anything. that level can change almost minute by minute, because what you're looking for in urine is a repository of drug over a period of time since the last time they've urinated. So again, you know, a spot test on a person's urine, that level really doesn't mean anything, and that level can't be used to all of a sudden go, yeah, John employee was impaired. You know, his level was 20,000. Didn't matter that he's prescribed, you know, oxycodone 10 milligrams every morning. You know, he's still positive. You know, an MRO where his or her weight isn't going to come out to you and tell you that. Could it potentially be impairing? Yes, but the drug screen in and of itself does not define impairment. You know, so again, MRO determination of impairment, you know, really the only drug that I could come out definitively and say, you know, when they're positive, they were impaired, is for marijuana in oral fluid. You know, marijuana drug testing looks for THC. The detection window on oral fluids around 16 hours or so after use. We discussed that the impairment window is at least 24 hours long, if not longer. So what I can say is if a person has a positive oral fluid test for THC, I can say to a high degree of professional certainty that the person was impaired at the time of collection. There's really no other drug screen that I'm allowed to be that I can do that in. Even cocaine, because the detection window in cocaine is about 48 hours in oral fluid. So therefore, I don't know if they were acutely intoxicated. I don't know if they were profoundly impaired and crashing after that use. I don't know, because the window is just too long to make a definitive claim of impairment. I can certainly testify to the fact that the use of illicit drugs is impairing. The use of illicit drugs do cause employers risk, but I can't say definitively that cocaine use caused that accident. That's just one of those things that, you know, based upon the science, I can't say, again, unless talking about THC and oral fluid. You know, again, because in all other scenarios, drug testing has little bearing on interpreting impairment. You know, illicit drug use does cause workplace issues, but whether it caused direct impairment to that particular issue cannot be said. Now, laws vary. You know, I practiced in Virginia for years as a, you know, occupational health physician, family physician. And in Virginia, the law is that the burden of proof is on the donor to prove his or her positive drug screen did not impact their workplace injury. So a positive drug screen in a for-cause post-accident situation was an automatic reason a company could deny the claim in Virginia. It's just because the employee would somehow have to prove that their illicit use of methamphetamine didn't you know, impact their job performance in a way that they got hurt. However, if you go to the state just north of Virginia, Maryland was positioned completely opposite. So Maryland's law was you as the employer, in order to deny the workman comp claim, had to prove that the illicit drug use was directly affected the person's ability to work. A whole different, a state away, you know, a border away, the stance completely flipped. And the states around the country have one of those two stances as you go through. And again, that's just is what it is. But again, using a urine test and trying to determine impairment, again, the window of detection being about a week for nearly all the drugs, it is really hard to say, yes, they were definitely impaired at the time of collection. So impairment detection, you know, if you need impairment detection, I would really say, you know, have a medical exam done in conjunction with your testing. You know, unless it's an alcohol test, because alcohol level equals impairment level, right? So if a person blows a 0.27, yeah, they're impaired. You know, there's no doubt about that. It's just because, you know, how alcohol alcohol works, as we talked about. But if you have someone who has that you want an impairment evaluation done, their alcohol test shows 0.00, you want to have that examination done. Because there are a variety of prescription medications, several of which do not show up on routine, drug screening panels that cause impairment. So you may have someone using, some sort of impairing drug or mixture of drugs where the drug screen is going to be negative, or the drug screen may be positive but overturned on medical review to negative. But that impairment on the job site can still, require some form of employment action, whether it's to talk about the person about reasonable accommodation, or talk to the person that you can't be impaired on the job site due to the nature of the thing, and you have to stop using said things and be able to be, come here, so to speak, sober and not impaired. Again, from that perspective, having that medical examination gives you that ability to say that, they're impaired, because that impairment is more of a medical diagnosis. It is not a drug screen, so to speak, determination. That urine screen, again, that oral fluid screen, with the exception of THC, that hair screen really has no bearing on impairment at the time of collection. And again, also remember, if you see that one slide where you showed the person wobbling all over, stumbling, slurring, that type of impaired person, when you send them to the clinic, I would strongly recommend that you do get a medical evaluation, not only to protect yourself as a company. That person was so improperly impaired that you may not want him or her back on your job site, even if their testing is negative due to the degree of impairment, but you also may save a life. So I have the story in my clinic of a guy who came in, was profoundly impaired, blew a 0.00 breath alcohol. He looked bad. I called the company saying, I'd like to do an evaluation of this guy. I don't feel good. Send him home. The company said, yeah, go ahead and do it. When I went ahead and did it, his blood sugar was well over 500. And the reason that he smelled funny and the reason he was impaired was that he was going through a diabetic crisis, and he needed to be admitted to the intensive care unit for immediate management. So he didn't die that day. So those, that's, an exceptional circumstance, but I always trigger back to that. If someone really looks bad at your job site, get the medical evaluation as part of that impairment, because you may find the person was, positive for heroin and positive for this and that, and again, you're able to, if you can offer employees assistance, do whatever. If from an employment perspective, you terminate, follow your policy there. But for every one of those guys, you may detect that person that's having some other kind of incident that needs medical attention, and it's just not, some sort of illicit use impairment. So from a state statutes perspective, there's no states that prohibit reasonable suspicion testing. But remember, some states have statutes on what constitutes reasonable suspicion, what kind of policy and policy posting requirements you have and such. Again, these are the states that have no definition. Here's the states that have a definition. I really showed this slide not for you all to start writing down, what states there are, but just in terms of knowing that there are differences, that Arizona has a definition and Colorado doesn't, so you can do your due diligence with your, policy people to make sure that you capture those nuances within your policy. So how to set up or improve your program. Again, a best practice recommendation here is have a policy. Train your staff on that policy, so that they know what it is, how to capture it, create a worksheet. I love worksheets in this regard. Never have a potentially impaired employee drive themselves to the testing site. I've had that happen before. If they are driving themselves and run over the 4-year-old, it's your liability, not that person's. Strongly consider having a medical evaluation for any visibly impaired people. And again, your specimen selection really should be oral fluid and urine. Hair has no place in reasonable suspicion testing, since hair detects a window from 7 days, 7 days prior to the drug screen being collected out to 90 days prior to the drug screen being collected. So you're not even getting a window within a week of the person, being tested. So again, it's one of those things that really has no place in for-cause testing. This is a sample for-cause testing policy. And again, the employer shall require the employee to submit the drug and alcohol testing. So again, there are several of these things. This is a very truncated version of this, but you can find these. Your employment attorneys, I'm sure, have these in templated format. And really the take-home message here is, what are the specific contemporaneous articulable observations? So what are the trigger points and observations? The big thing is look for change in behavior, change in attitude, change of impairment. Document observation of paraphernalia, of course. Note impairment. And remember, impairment is a medical diagnosis and really not a drug screen determination. And to get that physician evaluation when someone is notably impaired on your job site. That's my big grand finale. Hopefully you all got something out of it to help your program move forward in a meaningful way. As people are returning to your job sites and you're following all those best practices in regards to social distancing, personal protective measures, cleaning things, again, look for people that may, due to the stress of being out of work, the stress of the situation, look for those, people demonstrating those changes that you may want to compel testing for as they return to your job site.